Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. These are the episodes of the podcast ASW. Its continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new lists and new classifications, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Which means this week we talk with Neil Carpenter in a sponsored interview about managing the minimization of attack surfaces in containers in order to minimize the CVEs we care about. Gather an away team and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Tired of the endless cycle of cloud vulnerabilities? Avoid over 95% of CVEs with minimal container images from Minimus. No bloated base layers, no unnecessary packages, just what your app needs to run. Drop Minimus images into existing deployments to dramatically reduce your attack surface and remediation work. Maximum security, minimum effort. That's Minimus. Visit securityweekly.com/Minimus to learn more. This is episode 344, recorded August 18th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Happy Monday. How are you?
Happy Monday. I'm doing well. I'm thinking it's the anniversary of Gene Roddenberry's birthday. That's why I always sneak in a fun Star Trek reference for in August. But part of the away team for this week is Neil, whose passion for getting ahead of security problems comes from over a decade of leading customer-facing security incident response teams at Microsoft and seeing what happens when attackers win. He also helped build cloud-native security at Twistlock, StackRox, Torque, and Orca Security before joining Minimus, and today he's joined us here. Hello, Neil. Hello. Thank you for joining.
Hey, good morning. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, and happy minimization. Or the theme, as I teased, is let's have small containers, but maybe just saying small containers doesn't immediately convey exactly what the benefits are. And honestly, small is a little bit hand wavy too. So those are perhaps the two themes we should talk about here. Exactly. So why do we want a small container in the first place? What's the benefit?
Yeah. I think in one sense, this was always the promise of containers, right? We were going to build microservices. We were going to build just the minimal amount in there. And what it turns out is it's really easy to throw everything into a container image. And so what we see is a lot of container images that are based on, a fat OS image, a Debian, a Ubuntu, CentOS, whatever it is. Even the minimal ones, the Alpine, the UBI, the Debian Slim, still have a lot in them. And then you add everything in there that you might ever need to create a gold image that you're using, or maybe you just pull from Docker Hub and use it. And so you end up with an image that's got a lot of stuff that's really not needed in your final application, rather than really being minimal, rather than being the most micro of services, if you will. Which is, that's happened because it's very convenient. It's much harder if you build a minimal image for your developer community, and then they keep coming back and saying, well, I need this, I need this, I need this. It's much lower friction if you start with everything in it, hand it to them, and let them build on top of it and run with it.
Right, and that's the thing. It's the I need this is the trap, because it's one thing. There's a lot of easy phrases in AppSec. Start with an asset inventory. Start with a small container. But in practice, these things tend to not succeed very well. So how do you have that conversation with developers that are like, well, we just need this one more thing and this one more thing, and suddenly you do have a larger container than you expected?
Well, I think the one more thing is really, some of that is to move away from OS packages and into language packages, if you will, where possible. So instead of installing something from the Debian package manager or Ubuntu package manager, install a Python module, a Node module, or whatever language you're writing in that accomplishes that. is going to help you manage that. I think it's, and the reason I say it'll help you manage that is it moves the burden from the gold image maintainer, if you will, to the developer. The developer can manage their own dependencies and what is installed in their part of the build of the container image. And rather than having to build it in the base and move from there.
And so part of that, the subtext here, maybe we haven't been so clear about, or maybe it is just obvious because there are minimal containers now, but the idea is we're shrinking attack surface, right? We don't want just all these extra dependencies that have a CVE in them that for some reason, or in some orgs, or maybe many orgs, to use some qualitative numbers here, say, you've got to fix this. But I think this comes into that aspect of how much are we caring about CVEs, and how much are we caring about attack surface because of CVEs versus attack surface for something else? Is there a better strategy here, to a way to convey this is just a good engineering principle?
Yeah. And I think, attack surface is an interesting term, right? There's lots of things I could take that to mean. While you were asking that question, I thought of attack surface in multiple different ways. I would start with CVEs, because how much we care depends a lot on the organization. But a lot of organizations, and if I start with the deep end, right? If I start with something like FedRAMP, FedRAMP as it is today basically says you've got to patch everything high and critical within like a week to 2 weeks, and everything medium low in a slightly longer duration. That's a lot of work, and a lot of organizations that aren't FedRAMP have sort of focused on that kind of benchmark. You got to patch everything that is patchable, and we're going to have a metric that says you must do it within this period of time. And what comes out of that typically, there's a great report that Scientia did in 2023 that covers this. And they really looked at, out of the number of new CVEs an org gets within a month, how many of them can they actually patch? And the answer, from 100 new CVEs to 10 million new CVEs, was basically 10%, no matter what. They've got a great chart in there, and it's a scatter plot. Some orgs are hitting 12.5%. I know I've talked to a few security leaders who are like, well, we're over that, but I don't think anybody's above like 20%. Some are more like 7.5%. But they're just, you're not patching every new vulnerability that you get, no matter how hard you try, and you're investing a lot of effort in that. And so, the question becomes, how do I get better at that? If I try to patch everything and I can only patch 10%, the Venn diagram of what I patch and what matters hopefully touches, but it probably doesn't overlap much. So for a couple of years now, we've been talking a lot about prioritization. When we look at AppSec tools, when we look at cloud security tools and sort of everything in between, it's, okay, is this exposed? Is it reachable? And those being exposed is basically, is the asset this is running on open to the internet? Reachable.
Bug bounty researcher find it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Reachable typically meaning, can I make it from the edge of that endpoint to the actual code that's vulnerable? Is it a crown jewel? What's the asset context? Is it touching sensitive data? Is it interesting business processes? Is it part of an attack path? All of these sorts of, is it likely to be exploited? Is it known to be exploited? Putting all of that together, at least then you probably are not patching more than 10%, but your Venn diagrams are overlapping a lot more. You're patching things that
and
really
one of the things there is that the what you're describing definitely resonates with me. I recognize a lot of orgs doing that. But for me, and we're touching on one of my, let's call it the pet peeves of AppSec areas of focus, is that still feels like we need to analyze every single CVE. There's still a lot of work that just goes into, okay, rather than do I patch this CVE, do I care about this CVE? But it's still such a granular focus.
Yeah.
If we just ignored that and said, I'm only going to just care about updating dependencies whenever there's a new version or on a sprint by sprint basis, or call it every other sprint. How much do we think orgs would actually lose risk-wise in taking that approach and almost saying we're not necessarily ignoring AppSec, but ignoring here's a new CVE, the interrupt-driven aspect of CVEs.
Yeah.
That's my complaint I'm trying to tease out here.
Yeah, and I think if we could just say we can ignore AppSec, this could be a very short podcast. But let's not do that. I think there's a proactive and a reactive component. And you always have to be reactive, because at some point there's going to be another log for shell. There's going to be another something that creates a fire drill that's severe enough you have to react. And every org's going to have a line for where that is. How much do we have to be interrupt driven, and how much do we have to say, here's a critical severity vulnerability. The EPSS score is 95%, so we know it's almost certainly going to be exploited in the next 30 days. We've got to go fix this. You've got to draw a line somewhere there. And the proactive, let's update dependencies. It's certainly, I would like to believe everybody is doing that already. I don't think that's the case, though. I think lots of people are very much it works, I'm not going to touch it. I don't want to know what breaks if I update this.
Yeah, and that's excuse me, that's that trap of maybe this, the SemVer minimum version isn't going to be, or at least it's not supposed to be, a breaking change. But that can also be a roll of the dice, and that's some extra work just going through the update.
But
and that's where
I want to go back, because we were talking about attack surface reduction, and I work for a company called Minimus. It's pretty clear that minimalism in container images is where I'm coming from. One of the interesting things about this approach has been we've talked about sort of patching everything and that not working, prioritizing and getting closer to it, but still spending a ton of effort on everything. What we're seeing is, if we reduce the amount of noise going into the system, if we pull out the things that aren't necessary, we start breaking out of that 10%. We make it much easier for developers to spend that time to say, instead of having to update 50 things or some crazy amount of stuff, I've got a much more limited set of things that I have to update. They're all part of my dependencies. They're all related to my code. I've got a much better chance of being able to do the analysis. Say, yeah, I can do this. Yeah, this is okay. Ultimately it reduces, by taking out extra stuff, extra modules and packages from my container image, I become more able to focus on the things that are meaningful and put my time into them.
I'm sort of curious, Neil, and this is not meant in a bad way, but like, containers been around for a while now.
Yeah.
Twistlock in my previous company were probably close to 10 years ago now, I think 8. Are people still not getting how to use a container I mean, I'm not using containers very much myself right now, so I'm not sure what state of the art is, but are people still not getting this, or what's driving you guys to do this? Is this really still a thing?
Oh, this is definitely still a thing. I think, honestly, there's a certain amount of the commodification of containers over that 10 years. And I was at Twistlock on the other side of it. So, it's 10 years ago, people who were working on containers were very focused on the sort of fiddly bits that made them go together, because there wasn't a huge ecosystem out there. Mm-hmm. In 2025, a lot of it has been commodified, whatever the word is. And so there are far more people running things on containers, and not as worried about, how the sausage is made, if you will. They're just taking it and running with it, adding their stuff on top of it and building it. Over time, we've seen some progress towards minimalization. All these words today. We've seen things happen. We've seen Alpine as sort of as sort of a mid-step, right? And I think Alpine is great for some of the attack surface reduction. It's a little dicey in other areas. I think it causes people some problems moving from glibc to Musel and sort of all of the different things there. We've seen UBI, we've seen Debian Slim. Certainly there have been some organizations that have gone all the way to, we're going to build our own distroless images with only what we need. I think with varying levels of success. Like that's a fairly easy thing to do if you're only using Golang. If Golang is your entire, you can build your statically linked Golang binaries, drop them in a distroless image, and run with it. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing something larger, if you're in the Python, Node, sort of PHP, whatever else, that becomes much more complicated. And so what happens is, in organizations that have focused on building their own images, really get bogged down in that. It becomes very difficult, very expensive. And there's a tendency to move back to something that's more of a commodity, easier to use, less costly to use.
And I think that kind of echoes my curiosity near the beginning about just that the call it bloat creep, just to make up a fun term of just here's more packages, more dependencies. Because as you mentioned, I love the idea of Go because you're just statically linking. Anything in that binary is only what it actually needed. You could actually strip away, and here's just this one big binary. I'm curious too, how much have you seen that type of engineering consideration, engineering approach, similar to WebAssembly? Is WASM sneaking in here as well, in the sense that not only do you have a containerized in spirit, but you've got a sandbox environment that's self-contained, that is, call it a big bloated V8 engine rather than a container. But maybe this is a better approach just for 2025 in the future.
I think I'm a security person, right? I'm a terrible developer, which is amusing in itself. But I haven't seen a lot of that. I will say I think there's a different set of vulnerability management problems that creep in with something like Golang. And it's because vulnerability scanners don't know entirely what to do with your Golang binary. So in the Twistlock days, in sort of 2017, we knew that Golang vulnerabilities existed, vulnerabilities in Golang modules. We didn't really have a way of saying, and you have it here, because it was statically linked, because it was one blob. Now, what's happened since then is all the vulnerability scanners have started to take apart the manifest inside the Golang binary. Go, okay, here's all the modules you have, and here's all the vulnerabilities in them. That then creates a lot of noise in other ways, because it's not always clear if you're actually impacted by that vulnerability. And in fact, sort of Vex, there's a whole set of thinking around how you machine automate doing this as a vendor, but it becomes increasingly complicated. It's also not easy. How do I remediate if I've got a Golang binary from some vendor and one of the modules in it has a vulnerability? How do I remediate that? I've got to go back to the vendor. I've got to go back and forth with them as they go, well, no, that doesn't really impact us because we don't use that, or whatever. We don't use that functionality within that module, or sort of whatever the answer is. There's all this extra friction there that scanning Golang for vulnerabilities is introduced that didn't exist 10 years ago.
Yeah, was this statically linked OpenSSL the old version I care about, or was it only used to handle base 64 decoding and nothing else? That's absolutely, I've absolutely seen that before, especially early days of Go and Heartbleed era.
Yeah.
Part of this conversation makes me think of, is the pitch here more even just about we want SBOMs for a container? Or because I know we talked about we're trying to minimize what's in here, but it's sort of, it sounds like we just want to know what's in here with better confidence. And this is why I'll be the one to introduce the buzzword of SBOM. So is that what we're just moving to in this conversation?
That's a component of it. I'm not sure it's everything, right? SBOM has had this long walk in the wilderness of figuring out what it's really good for. So many times I've been on the vendor side for a long time now, right? And I've continuously had people asking me, oh, does your product do S-bombs? Do you have S-bombs? Can you generate S-bombs? And I'm the sort of nerd who will immediately go back and say, well, what do you need them for? What are you doing with them?
Fair question.
And up until maybe the last 6 months, the answer was continuously, I don't know, I just have to submit them here.
Yep.
Right. So it's only recently that we've started to figure out how to process S-bombs, how to do useful things with them, how to use an S-bomb to do vulnerability assessment, even without having to have the whole container image or the whole whatever we're scanning, just running the S-bomb through the vulnerability data we have and spitting out what's there. And that's not to minimize. If you have a requirement that you have to submit an S-bomb to this portal, I can't argue with that, right? Like somebody has decided you have to have that. You're not going to ship, you're not going to run, you're not going to do your job if you can't meet that requirement. But it didn't have a ton of security value. I think we're still figuring out what the security value of SBOM is and how we use it effectively and what we do with it. And I mentioned VEX earlier, so I sort of broke the seal on SBOM before you did indirectly. So if folks aren't familiar with VEX, VEX is kind of an add-on to SBOM, if you will. But what it lets you do, it lets you address that Golang problem I was talking about earlier. It lets you as a vendor say, we used this Golang module or this Python package or whatever it is in what we ship to you. We know that your scanner is going to find a vulnerability in it, but we're affected. We've already fixed it, and here's the fixed version. We're unaffected because whatever reasons, right? We're using OpenSSL only to do base 64. We don't call any of the affected stuff. I don't know, I saw one the other day for us where our reason is, this is a Debian-only vulnerability. We're not based on Debian, whatever it is. And there's a fourth status in there, like we're investigating, which is a really strong use of SBOM and generally, because the alternative, what happens, and I've been doing this for a long time and hitting these things. There's a constant support burden where somebody's scanning everything. They scan the thing you ship them, they find a vulnerability, and they immediately open a support case saying, okay, you've got this new high severity vulnerability, critical severity vulnerability. When are you going to fix it? And if the answer is we're not going to fix it, it doesn't affect us, here's why. You've just got people continuously opening cases.
Yeah, and that's before we get off that, because I think you used the term just now, severity, and that's what CVSS is to be. Yeah. I'm resisting being overly pedantic, but it's not risk, right? And that was what implied what you just said. It doesn't necessarily affect us, or we're not using it.
Yeah.
But wow, I do not want to have that conversation for every single CVE that comes up. That support ticket, you're going to get killed by support tickets for as much as you're going to get killed by vuln fix tickets. So what is have you discovered ways of reframing that conversation to say, we're only fixing 10% of the CVEs, but the goal isn't 80%, 90%, 100%. That's the wrong way to look at this. The better way is fill in the blank here, but trying to convey that framing with confidence so the developers, maybe they appreciate, I'm not going to say they don't care, but they care about not being interrupted, and security is going to not be able to report to the board who may or may not be cybersecurity influenced or informed, and just saying, we want to see the number go up, or this, we want to see a high number rather than a low number.
Yeah. So, all of the stuff we've talked about before is part of that, right? Prioritization helps you answer that question. It helps you get the right things to the developers. It helps you build the right dashboard for the board to say, we fixed 100% of what we were really worried about versus we fixed 10% of everything. Ultimately, and once again, this is where I'm coming from. I think the more I can minimize what's going into that, the more I can move towards pulling out all of this extra noise, the more focused I am. And I think the developers, you asked earlier, like, how do I get developers to embrace this?
Yeah.
I think you have to show a virtuous cycle of, if you move towards minimal images, if you move towards reducing the amount of noise going into what you're building, we're going to reduce the number of times we break your build because there's a new a CVE in there. We're going to reduce the number of JIRA tickets we throw at you demanding you fix something. We're just gonna stop. We're not gonna stop. There's going to be new vulnerabilities in what you build, no matter how minimal it is. But we're going to increase what I'm calling the mean time to CVE. Right? It's instead of being every 5 days, there's a new vulnerability in your image. It's going to be every 30 days. It's going to be every 60 days. And that's a really big net increase in your ability to focus on features and bugs and the stuff your job actually is, versus the things the security team's throwing over the wall edge.
The sense of time, I always like to wear my Time Lord top hat here. So time always comes up as a metric for me. You mentioned 5 days, 30 days, 60 days, and I think anecdotally, I'll say a lot of CISOs, but maybe CISOs at smaller orgs or smaller companies with developing AppSec teams, they're always like, well, how long do you require? How long do you wait? Is it 7 days, 30 days, 90 days? Because it's sort of that we don't want to be worse than our peers, but we don't want to be, better is the opposite of worse, but we don't want to be more aggressive than our peers and burn out the developers. Is there a time frame that has been successful or palatable to both security team and developer teams for saying, there's CVEs, but we'll wait those 30 days. We'll just do this once a month.
I mean, I'm not sure there's any one answer to that. But earlier you started to make the differentiation between severity and risk. And I think that's really critical as you consider where you're gonna chart, what your standards are gonna be, what your SLAs are gonna be. And CVSS is a really strange number. I've always thought they were really strange numbers. And I had a conversation recently where somebody said to me, and it was like a light beamed down on me, CVSS is not the severity, it's the maximum possible severity. It's the absolute worst that vulnerability could possibly be if it was exploited. So you have a lot of, critical severity vulnerabilities, CVSS 10, right at the top of the scale, that aren't that bad, except in one specific scenario, or if somebody managed to do one specific thing.
Like when a Cisco device is turned on.
Yeah, well, but you are getting that as critical, and if your thinking is tied to critical, high, medium, low, that's going to peg out your scale. It's going to demand attention. But when you look at the actual risk, not just how bad could this possibly be, but is it likely to be exploited? Is it accessible? Is it sort of all of those things? The risk is much lower. And so I think it's really important to think about that in whatever you land on. I've been a really big fan, and unfortunately it hasn't gotten a lot of traction yet, but I hope springs eternal. There's a system out there called SSVC, which is Stakeholder Specific Vulnerability, something that starts with C. It is intentionally CVSS backwards.
Yes.
CIS has been talking a lot about it, but what it is, instead of a score, it's a decision tree that starts with, is this known to be exploited? Now, I think I would start with, is it likely to be exploited? But the nice thing about it as written is you can sort of generate your own tree and use it. But it starts with, is this exploitable? Is it known to be exploited? And then it moves to, what would the impact of an exploit be? And then it moves to, what is the asset context? What would the impact of exploitation be? And so this then gives you an action. And I forget the exact terms they use, but it starts with, like, do whatever you normally do. So those time frames you were talking about, we're going to patch in 90 days or 30 days or 7 days or whatever it is. Stick with your standard. And then there's a sort of like, hey, maybe keep an eye on this one. And then there's a definitely keep an eye on this one. It's probably going to be a problem. And finally, there's an act now. Like this one is exploitable. The exploit would cause total chaos. The assets it is on are critical. The impact would be high. You've got to do something with this one. I really like whether you sort of implement SSVC or you just take the thinking. I really like that approach of saying, what could it do? How bad would it do? Or, first of all, is it actively being exploited or is it likely to be exploited? How bad?
Yeah, and that's to throw in our four-letter terms. That's like EPSS is trying to cover that as well and answer that. And then CISA. So there's my four letters, but they only have a KEV. Just they're known exploited vuln list. That seems at least reliable because this is what other people are getting hit with now. It doesn't mean that necessarily what's not on the list should it be patched, but it's definitely a helpful determinant.
But what's interesting about this, from when we think, at least when I think modern AppSec, the stats, we don't have enough AppSec people, so you need the developers to come up to speed or be educated or blah, blah. Particularly if they're the ones using these containers or saying, let's use containers or build with them. So the base problem is those folks are usually not sophisticated in their, I'll say, comprehension of security. I think I can say that safely without getting the pitchforks out. So if they don't have that sophistication, part of the reason CVSS is showing a maximum worst case is because, well, that's what the manager's asking for. People try to figure out, do we patch this or not? What's the worst case that happens if we don't patch this? So what I'm sort of thinking through is, how do we provide enough sophistication or understanding to the folks that are using these tools so that they're able to, I think that's why we have so many of these different four-letter things, is people are trying to get other folks to that in an easier way. But is that the best way forward there, or how do we sort of?
So, John, I'm going to challenge you on one thing there. You said developers aren't domain experts. They're not good at this. They maybe don't have the depth. I really think the onus is on security teams. I think for a long time, we have done one of two things. We've either not provided developers significant visibility into what is problematic and how to fix it, or we've overwhelmed them and provided them far too much and made it impossible for them to do it. And ultimately, if you hand a developer, 1,600 vulnerabilities and say, do something with this, what's going to happen is absolutely nothing. They're going to route around you. They're going to figure out how to not do security's bidding, right? And actually, it's funny. I had this conversation with a security leader at a event recently. He came up to me. He was like, I want to know how you can solve my problem. And I said, I love solving problems. What's your problem? He said, well, I've got this AppSec tool that allows me to generate a pull request for every vulnerability. So we've turned it on for every vulnerability. 80% of all the pull requests in the entire company are coming from security. And so I'm looking kind of shocked. He goes, so my problem is, how do I get developers to stop ignoring me? And I was like, well, my friend, you stop doing that. You've got to figure out which ones are actually important. You can't make 80% of their workload your problems. And he was like, oh, no, I can't do that. How do I make them take me seriously? At which point I was like, I can't help you. I can't solve this problem. It's been a pleasure meeting you. I'm walking away from this conversation now.
Yeah. And I know jokingly earlier you said, Neil, I'm not a good developer. And I think that's an excellent way to say that, even on the show, we've been very careful and very vocal about getting away from developers don't care about security, because I like to invert that and say, security doesn't know anything about development, or they don't care about development. And that's a great anecdote to point out. Oh, we're not making them chase CVEs. We've done all the work. All they have to do is approve that PR, forgetting the fact that sometimes it's not tests. There's not tests. Sometimes those break. Sometimes those just aren't necessary. So why are we making anyone do this? Because it's that sort of thing. We're going to measure this because it's a number we can track. I'm going to go slightly off topic. Same with phishing exercises. It's a number we can track. How many people clicked on this versus, oh, maybe we wanted do we have FIDO rolled out? Or do we have other things when we're talking about container, in the sense of, let's get beyond just the image itself and the ecosystem around that container to say, would we even care about this RDOS? Or is this RCE even possible? Or Are these perfectly immutable so that it's going to be harder to gain a foothold? These types of things are where my mind goes. So,
I think one of the things that's really flummoxed security teams in container security, and it's been this way for 10 years now, and it continues to be, is the problem is the same. If I have a vulnerability that allows for remote code execution, and I've got it in a bunch of VMs on-prem, and I've got a bunch of container images running in Kubernetes in the cloud, the impact of that is effectively the same. Somebody can execute code, maintain persistence, do recon, move all the things attackers want to do. What's different is how I fix it. Bunch of VMs, I create a ServiceNow ticket, somebody comes along at 2 a.m., patches them, reboots them if they have to, off they go. I often say I can't patch running containers. Somebody will pedantically point out that's not exactly true, but it's not useful, right? If I have 40 running containers and I go manually run apt-get upgrade in each one of them, that's not only a bad idea. The moment I scale up or down, I'm getting new copies from the base image or the image I'm using that are unpatched. What's different then is not the risk, not what it'll do. It's how I address it. What I have to do is not just get somebody to go patch them at 2 a.m. I've got to get a developer to rebuild the image, retest the image, reship the image, and then redeploy those containers. So my constituency is dramatically different. I think it's been very hard for some security teams to get around having to interoperate with development teams directly, much more than they used to. The companies I've talked to that do the best job of this are companies that have invested in how do we build bridges between dev and sec? How do we build security champions among the developer community? How do we enable them to have the right data to make the right decisions? So I think that's a huge piece of the challenge.
And I think part of the challenge is also trying to, speaking of time, keep ourselves constrained within the container of a 30-minute news segment. But Neil, you've helped us talk through that without being too flummoxed for all of us to pick up another fun word that's come up today. But before we let you leave, Neil, we always like to ask our guests to describe AppSec in our own minimal 3 words. So how would you approach this topic for us?
So I would say address risk early.
Short and sweet. And I appreciate that it's risk, not CVEs or CVSS. So yeah. I want to thank you both for that wonderful phrase and for joining us for this segment, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Also want to say thanks to John and thank everyone who's been listening. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week. Ransomware, supply chain attacks, 0 days. Cyber threats don't wait, and neither should your defenses. With ThreatLocker, you're not just reacting to threats, you're stopping them before they start. Our Zero Trust endpoint protection locks down your environment with pinpoint control over what's allowed to run and what's not. No guesswork, no blind spots. Just proactive, built-for-now security that keeps your business moving. Want to see how a true default deny strategy works? Head over to securityweekly.com/threatlocker and take the first step towards shutting the door on threats before they even knock. Security Weekly and CyberRisk TV are headed back to one of the biggest identity security events of the year, Octane 2025, put on by Okta, live September 24th through 26th from the vibrant city of Las Vegas. Octane 2025 brings together the best minds in identity, security, and technology innovation. And this year, we're pumping up the volume. Security Weekly will be on site in full force with Mandy Logan and Adrian Sanabria leading the charge. Get ready for a live-streamed executive interviews, exclusive on-site editorial coverage from SC Media, and brand new this year, a live-streamed episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. It's your chance to engage with identity leaders, dive into the future of AI security, and hang out with your favorite Security Weekly hosts. And here's the best part. Security Weekly listeners get an exclusive discount. Just head to securityweekly.com/octane, register, and use promo code OKTNSCMA25 to get your conference pass for $200. See you there. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just finished our sponsored interview with Neil Carpenter about minimizing the attack surfaces in containers and the larger push for minimizing how much we should care about CVEs in the first place. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and one thing we do care about is joining us at InfoSec World 2025, October 27th to 29th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort, Lake Buena Vista, with pre-event workshops October 25th to 26th, and post-event workshops October 29th through 30th. So basically, hang out the last week of October in Florida. Connect, learn, and level up your cyber game. Save 25% now with code ISW25-SW at securityweekly.com/ here's more letters and numbers, ISW 2025. And speaking of letters and numbers, John, we've got a lot of news it's been a while since we've caught up, so let's see how many CVEs and CVSS scores we could tease out of this segment. I don't know.
I'm here for it.
Okay, that's good. One of the things I wanted to start off was the made you reset vulnerability. This is kind of cool because it's also in a protocol. And in the intro, I always say, hello, protocols, packets, and programs. I've been always wondering, should I take out protocols or one of those and maybe replace it with a parser or another P word? But I don't know. But because there's an HTTP2 vulnerability, I'm at least keeping the protocols in that welcome for at least another 6 months. We'll see. But fanboying aside, this was a neat write-up for two reasons. One, the write-up itself is kind of in two parts. An overview of what is this reset vulnerability and how can it lead to a DOS, and then a second part that's some more technical details if you really want to get in there. But if you don't need the technical details, essentially, HTTP2 has frames that create streams, and with any type of effective denial of service attack, you want to be able to come up with a way where the attacker can use an asymmetrically minimal or smaller set, is sort of a callback to our last segment, set of resources to generate traffic, and then have an order of magnitude greater amplitude or amplification that the server has to deal with. Long story short, maybe John is still there. I haven't lost him yet. If you can trick the server into seeing, the client ran into an error. I need to reset this connection. Got to reset this connection. It may be resetting the HTTP2 stream, but there might be some back-end CPU cycles that are still being burnt on the server side, because there was an HTTP1 backend, this connection was actually going through a proxy, or there was something else that said the client knows that it's being reset, but the server has not canceled its work. It's still going and completing the work, and that's how you can get the client to make a couple requests, but the server to spend all that precious CPU time that could have been Bitcoin mining or LLM token mining on things. So this is the way I'm going to introduce it, John. So help me out here. What is this protocol still interesting and appealing to you?
Oh no, I think it is.
Cool.
And I think you have to keep protocols, packets, and programs in the intro, because the parser is that's the thing with the bug. The bug's usually not in the protocol. I mean, sometimes it is, but it feels, I think we had a lot of, I'll say, hope for HTTP2. We thought, hey, new fresh start, this is going to be great, everything. But it feels like we're covering several vulnerabilities about the spec being either not fully fleshed out or as a result of the spec not being fully thought out. It's interesting. Looks like it hits most different web servers that implement the HTTP2. I don't have too much more to say. I think it's interesting. I think you did a good job covering it, so I don't have more to say. But we were talking about the last segment about minimal and all that type of thing, and you mentioned that too. But this is one of those components that if you're going to be running in a container wherever else, it's going to be running. So it's got, by definition, it has public exposure. Maybe not public, it has network exposure. So it's not something that you can just sort of sit in your hands and wait and see what happens. It's something that has to be addressed with.
And one of the other reasons this appealed to me as well is that acknowledges prior work. There's the rapid reset bug that was also a different client-initiated reset. Say, I'm going to reset this stream, and that was still a way to amplify the number of small packets you generate with large overhead on the server. So that was nice to see. But it's also that for the protocol that's been out for as long as it is, still finding some ways to muck about with, which is my favorite term, the state machine, or how mostly or typically the implementation goes a little bit inconsistent. And is that because the design was ambiguous, or the design was correct, but it could be interpreted in different ways? And I'm bringing that up only because if we're moving into the clear my throat, agentic AI world of natural language interactions between APIs, it's not like our natural language was very precise to begin with. We could look back at the OAuth 2.0 best practices doc to see all the ways that was fixing things. So,
well, maybe that's what's wrong, is they weren't using Gen AI to help them with the specification, and that's why.
I think that's why.
You know, I was thinking as you talk there on this, it's, if you think about just the categories of DOS attacks, or how do you DOS a server, there's sort of a few general buckets, and this fits into one of them. But can you either take all the, can you basically busy out the server by taking any connection possible and just doing that way? You can try to do this like minimal work on your part, maximum over there. And it's interesting to see these. It would probably be interesting for some folks to take those, come up with a list of, I think it's probably about 5 different ways, really top level things, and then just point that collection of ideas at a lot of these things we look at. Has someone done that with, I'm sure someone's tinkering with that with the chat things that, since you mentioned LLMs. But yeah, it's we'll see. It'll be. I'm hoping that this sort of goes down the number of vulns we're seeing with HTTP2. It's not huge, but it's still greater than I expected, at least.
Well, now, speaking of HTTP2, let's roll back to HTTP1 as well. And the crew over at Portswigger, James Cuttle and all, for as much as wonderful good work, not taking anything away from that they've done throughout the years with Burp and with the vulnerabilities, they're done with HTTP 1. 1.1, it's time to go. And that was one of their big pushes at Black Hat and DEF CON this year. And I linked to one of their Portswigger's articles. Admittedly, this is the slightly more marketing version of the article, but there's 2 reasons I wanted to keep this in. One is it still links to good research, good more technical details, but it's also a call to action for, call it the InfoSec community, to make more actionable, or not necessarily actionable, make more architectural or foundational recommendations when you're pen testing or when you're finding vulnerabilities in tech stacks, to say, this request smuggling is pervasive. There's no easy way to get rid of this or to combat this. And part of the problem with the HTTP 2 major reset is that a lot of times that HTTP 2 is just sitting in front of an old HTTP 1.1 server that doesn't know how to reset its connection, et cetera, stop its processing. And so his pitch is, let's stop doing that. I like it, I agree with it, but my mind goes back to, for the longest time, InfoSec community was saying, let's get on to TLS 1.2. Let's get off of TLS 1, TLS 1.1. And that took decades. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I want to be the cynical one this week, John, if you'll allow me. I don't know. Can I be cynical about this, or is there hope that we can get on to HTTP 2 or HTTP 3 for that matter?
Wow, look at you with the big ideas. I think. Oh wait, you're supposed to be cynical. I think you're bringing up a good point. It's a little bit. It comes back to sort of the concept of, like, us versus them. The security folks are generally making requests. Some not too bad. Hey, can you update this package, or can you fix this code? Things like this are a little heavier, right? You're asking for really an infrastructure change, and that's it. Yeah, it's a heavier lift. So I think it's with something like this, particularly when it's mentioned with architecture. I think if I was to sort of pile onto this article, what I'd say is, for those consultants out there, is not so much to be saying in your report, like, hey, this needs to be updated, but take a step back and go, hey, let's look at the architecture of this application. Let's figure out a plan over the next 3 to 6 months of how can you update this so it's it has a more secure stance. more secure posture. And from that point of view, then I suspect that would be more accepted than item 352, stop running HTTP 1.1.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I've seen those reports that get into like the third level of bullet points.
Yeah.
Is oh no, what are we doing here? It does feel on the opposite side of my cynicism. It does feel like a drop-in replacement for the protocol that the application layer shouldn't really care. This is HTTP is talking to a browser. That transport layer hopefully is an easy replacement, but we just haven't seen it. And so that's where we have to, as I said in the last segment, security has to have an appreciation for how development works. We can't just say, developers don't care about security. So developers can say, security doesn't care about development. That's not the healthy world to live in.
But I mean, it's also probably a chance for I'm thinking consultant can assess the viewpoint of this article or the target of this article. It's a chance for the consultants to have a discussion, right? It's like, hey, why are you guys running this? Is there a reason? Do you just not how to update that server? Did like the person take care of that leave? Or is it just, it's there and it's fast and you don't need any of the features, so you thought of HTTP2? Like what's the reasoning behind that?
Part of having reasoning behind code is, well, actually, what's the reasoning behind that is one of the great questions you ask of code. And here's an article that I had to pull out because it was 3 dots to root, how I found a path traversal in Microsoft's, and here's agentic web, NL web. And so here's our natural language. So this is why that was on my mind this week. But this researcher saw Microsoft making a big to-do about NL web. It's an open source project. They thought, let me go check it out, see what's in there. And they saw a very simple code snippet, safe path already. So there's a variable name. That's our evil bit RFC validation there. Safe path equals os.path.norm_path. So this is some Python code. But the gist of this is saying that norm path is just normalization, but it's normalizing the direction of your slashes. It's not removing directory traversals. So you need that normalization, as well as, here's our fun word of the day, canonicalization, to say, what's my ultimate destination path? Was it the classic etc password, etc shadow, or is it within the code to pull out some API keys here? But once again, it's just one of those dead simple %2f if you want to use your URL encoding to get to succeed at this type of attack. And what was nice is that also this write-up ends with some pretty good recommendations that aren't just just sanitize, do input sanitization everywhere. It was mentioned the input sanitization, but it also talked about worrying about your attack surface. So that's another word of the day. And looking at that final path validation, that canonicalization. So this was a nice write-up. I love the path traversal. That's the best I can come up with for our universal messages for the day from this article.
So this is first bringing up one thought in my head that's been on my head a lot the last few weeks. When I look at something nowadays, or even if I listen to someone giving a presentation, my ear is, not purposely, but frequently I will pick up on it if I think this sounds like it was generated by an LLM, and this article feels like it was written by one, or at least assisted. I think it's I like the idea, I like what they found, obviously, that type of thing. Etsy password doesn't impress me. Talk about shadow, guys. It's 2025. Yeah. And I understand that's always can be harder to get to, but come on, if you go do it right. I haven't wrapped my head around. I think the interesting thing here is actually the technology behind this, not so much the traversal, but NL web. I haven't read too much on it. That sounds like a whole big can of worms. So that's sort of where my interest is here. I might go back and play with that a little bit after this. Is if you want to go down that path of connecting, I almost said agentic AI, a generative AI to a web interface. I don't know if anyone listening right now is not cringing at that, right? It feels like a very insecure space. And that'll change because it's new tech and, the folks are playing with things and they'll come back and they'll think about security afterwards as usual. But this is the most, as a, I don't know if I can call it a framework or a system, but as a thing, this feels like one of the more out there ones that's going to be very interesting to go and poke around with. So probably not the last we've heard of this.
No, not the last. And I'm sure once we get the admittedly path reversal, very old school, once we get the old school path reversal, I'm sure there'll be cross-site scripting or something else simple in there. Then it'll be, well, what's the actual new controls, new concerns that are specific to the actual generative LLM part or generative AI in the sense of, this was a prompt injection. Here was a surprising vector where the agent read from into that classic. There is no distinction anymore between code versus data. Prompts are everywhere and anywhere. So definitely something we'll watch, something we'll cover, but hopefully we'll at least for me, I'm trying to find the interesting ones to cover rather than just, hey, this was yet another prompt injection. Yawn. But in the spirit of trying to find something new and different, here's an article, John, that is, I think on the surface and even on the subtext is mostly unrelated to application security, but I wanted to cover it for nerd reasons and for potentially some security reasons. So let's see if I succeed. So this is speeding up the JavaScript ecosystem -semver. So here's an engineer was looking, as many engineers do, the build is slow. Why? And so they were digging in and they saw that semver, of all things, was taking a lot of time. And semver is pretty much everywhere because what's our dependency? Are we pinned to a particular dependency? Do we need to bump this dependency up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And what the engineer found was they could make the code, this is semver that's everyone uses, can make the code up to just over 30 times faster. And what appealed to me is that there is absolutely an aspect of parsing in here. So yay, parsing comes up because parsing does have consequences for security when we get into more complicated parsers for images, video, audio. Those are things that are often rife with vulnerabilities and memory safety issues and such. But what was really neat, I encourage especially AppSec folks to read through this to get that appreciation of engineering thoughts, as well as asking those questions, not necessarily, why is this slow? Because we as AppSec don't want to introduce slowness into that CI/CD pipeline. But there's also, if we're talking about attack surface and let's say minimization, not necessarily of containers like we were talking about in the last segment, but just minimizing our dependencies, there was so much extra code in here that the engineer even showed that the original semver maintainers saw that it was slow. They introduced some caching to help things up, but by refactoring the code, you could almost get rid of caching and you actually now have that huge speed up and you didn't have to use that band-aid of caching to fix it, to address the problem. And so it reduced the size of code, increased the speed of the code, and it didn't get rid of semver as a dependency, but it at least minimized it. And all these to me speak very much to good security practices, even though if challenged, I couldn't point to a specific CVE or I couldn't rate this on a CVSS scale. Not that I would want to anyway, but this was my dev appreciation moment here. So that's what I wanted to bring to the table.
So I have to first say there are good uses for cache. So I don't want to say like cache is bad in general.
Yes.
So I think the interesting part here to me is, well, maybe not interesting, I'll nitpick. It's a 30x improvement over calls to semver, not over the overall build.
Yes.
So, okay, cool. I think you're going down an interesting path there, talking about, how do I rephrase what you said? Being able to have that chance to dive deep into a particular part of the application and look for performance and sort of strip things out and make it, do specifically what you want. That takes time. And I think that's probably, not saying that as a management type, but just like in general, there's only so many hours we have in a day. So where do we put that time into? I'm killing people at work because I'm doing this all the time now. It's like I start thinking like, hey, could I solve that with the Gen AI? But like, yeah, could I know I try not to do it all the time. I'm doing more than I should. But like, could I throw this at a robot and say, hey, you go have this go faster? And as again, a lot of people are now cringing as I say that because there's a pretty good chance the robot's going to break it. But then the same thing around could be security too. But also, if you're making these changes, what's the chance of affecting it in a negative manner, which is probably why a lot of people wouldn't go for that performance improvement. So yeah, it's interesting to think about, great to see, but when do you go down that path to do this? It's also sort of important to think about as well.
Yeah, because and part of that path, hopefully, I think one of the prerequisites there is you need some testing, not just on the performance as well, but to say, did we break anything on one of the edge cases that this didn't consider, as well as did we spend an inordinate amount of time fixing this one package that was 30x faster, but the wall clock build time dropped by a second. Mm-hmm. And so that's my begrudging acknowledgement to John might be right once again.
But to sort of take it back to the previous topic about DOS too, in a way, it's a form of DOS, right? Because a lot of us, myself included, we love to sort of, rat hole down that and figure out what's absolutely going on and do the performance improvement. But did you just DOS yourself compared to the rest of the code you were trying to get done? So yeah, it's just something to be careful about.
And also in the last segment, because a lot of the last segment was talking about dependencies. And one of the things, thankfully, that we didn't touch on or try to talk about was, let's just give all these dependency updates to an LLM to fix. And a little bit of, we acknowledge that in the sense of Neil's anecdote at the end of the CISO's like, oh, I opened up all these PRs, but nobody's paying attention to them. If we had an LLM open up all those PRs, you'd get the same response.
Well, the correct answer there is you need a second LLM to go through and approve the PRs. But
yeah.
I'll sell them that product next week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's where I would be curious if there is a way to figure out, hey, LLM, we have these 10, or if we're talking about NPM, I always have to tease NPM. If we were talking about these 100 dependencies that got pulled in from my hello world, how many of them could I just get rid of by rewriting one line of code I need from it? And that would be suddenly, maybe we added another 10 lines of code. Obviously, this is my hand-wavy podcaster metric. But if we just do that and we're not dealing with a bunch of point releases or all these other dependencies, that does feel like a win. And that's where a little bit of I do like the Golang, we're only going to compile what we actually use, that static compilation versus, shared. So there's some more engineering conversations or debates we could go down as well.
I think you're on to actually something very, at least in my world, timely. My little project here I'm playing with at home, the Gen AI is up to now, like I've got these Python files that are like 3,000 to 5,000 lines of code. Is that useful code? Guessing no. But we're now at such a scale, again, talking about DOS, and I'm trying to make this relevant to what we're talking about here, but that I'm not going to go through and review 5,000 lines of code that this thing created.
Right.
So I'm going through looking for, like, my first pass on it was like, hey, are there any functions not being used? And I think I removed about 500 lines doing that. But yeah, now how do I go back through and, because I'm going to try and get the robot to say, hey, is this really the best way to do this? Or can you refine it? Or what can you do? I mean, I'm guessing it should be, I don't think it should be 1,000 lines, but yeah, I think these tools are, come back in like 12 to 18 months is my guess. They'll be able to actually do some things like, the other, the one we talk about fairly frequently was it equals the package in the node package that, like, there's no the string comparison or something. There's a node package out there. It was like no reason for it to exist, and the robot might use it because it's out there. But this would be a good chance to go through robot or human and say, hey, is that what you should be using, or is there a more efficient, more secure way to do that?
Right. I think, and there's the classic. This is also old example, but the left pad example too. We just needed to trim some spaces or something like that. That's a couple lines of code. Maybe make that native in the language, or more fun, just write that line. And I was also going to add one other thing with, my joke with my prompt engineering hat on is the comma, but make it secure. I'm going to add now, but make it short, or but make it minimal implementation. So that will be my prompt engineering for the day. John, there were 2 articles that I threw in there. They're more of FYIs for readers. One was from the OpenSSF. It's From Beginner to Builder, Understanding OpenSSF Community and Working Groups. And as the title says, it's a list of different working groups. And I threw that in there for listeners and for the community out there who wants to figure out, how do I participate in what open source, what's going on, or what is the direction of security within these open source groups about what they're focusing on. And unsurprisingly, AI/ML is on there, supply chain is on there. There's memory safety if that's what you enjoy, but there's also a bunch of other, it's a good list of a dozen or so working groups. So good opportunities to network, to contribute to open source. And that's why I wanted to sort of make it a call for awareness, not to get too business speaky in there, but it might be a fun resource for people to follow up on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to say I would imagine our listeners have a sense of what's in this list, but keep something like this around for like your friends or coworkers. Like, I'll once every nowadays 2 or 3 months get someone hitting me up like, hey, how do I get into X, or what should I do with X, or like, I'm really curious, so how do I get into open source, like, these type of questions, how do I help the community? Here you go. I think this is great to keep around for those type of instances.
And one other thing is, we didn't talk too much about DEF CON Black Hat yet. I think we're still waiting to see a lot of the good analysis and watch through a lot of the presentations on our own. I did throw here, just as an FYI, DARPA did announce the winner of the AI Cyber Challenge. So congratulations to Team Atlanta and their win. We'll see if we can get them on. But I know we're good friends with Keith over at Trail of Bits. Their Buttercup came in second, and all of these competitors are open source. So all of those, the code is up on a repo, which I think I linked in there. If I forgot to, I'll make sure to add it before we post this. But there's more to talk about there. But I think we've hit our quota of mentioning Gen AI and LLMs so far. So that's what I wanted to mention on it. But I'll throw it over to you if there's any final comments you wanted to add there.
On that one, nothing to add. People have heard me talk enough about Gen AI for one episode.
Okay. Well, I always want to hear you talk about more on every episode, John. So thank you for this, and I'm looking forward to the next couple as well.
Excellent.
Thank you, everyone else, for joining. John, if you haven't subscribed, maybe I'll just say, remember to subscribe to the show. Check out the show notes, share us on the socials. And speaking of mumbling through things like outros and perhaps even intros, check out Man Without a Face by Midnight Fury. That's your synthwave recommendations for the week. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.